good to speak to a very distinguished audience like that again, like I did for 5 years when I served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. But in fact, it's a pleasure to be here and to congratulate the host university, Lake Superior State University, for hosting for the 6th time, I understand, the Arrowhead Model United Nations. And I was delighted to see the different colleges that have come for this occasion, and there seemed to be quite a buzz earlier at the dinner, as if you were getting to know each other for your different countries and getting to find lots to talk about. And I'm sure it goes on late into the night, much later maybe than some of the faculty realise. It's interesting that this is also in its 35th year. This is a very good continuity of this coming together and you being assigned different countries to think about their perspective. It is true, as Professor Gary Johnson said in the introduction, that I do have a particular interest in Indigenous peoples. I realised when I became UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that I had a role as coordinator of the Decade of Indigenous Peoples Worldwide, some 400 million people worldwide. But before that, I had a very interesting occasion which I'd like to tell you about, because it's a story about pure humanitarian generosity. And it happened during the great Irish potato famine. I know that there are quite a number of you of Irish heritage here, because a number of you came up earlier to tell me not only your surnames but also your connection with Ireland. The potato famine began in 1845 when the potato crop failed because of a disease from Latin America. And that was very devastating for poor peasant families, because the potato was their diet, that's what they ate, fed their children. And the other crops they had to use to pay the rent. And because the landlords were mainly English and pretty cruel, they had to pay the rent, and whether they could eat or not. So it was a very difficult period. Then the potato crop failed again in 1846. And in 1847, many people had either left Ireland and come on what they called coffin ships to Canada, the United States, very much to this part of the world, in fact, and ultimately to Australia, to various other places, including, of course, Britain next door. And many had died in Ireland or gone to workhouses to do sort of labour to receive some food. And the Choctaw people were gathering together in the spring of 1847 to mark the fact that they'd had to move from their tribal lands. And they talked about walking through a vale of tears to reach the part of Oklahoma that they came to. And so they were marking their 10th anniversary. And we don't quite know how they learned about an island far away where people were starving. We think it might have been a Patsy priest who told them. But they understood the problem, that the stable crop had failed for the 3rd year. And the Choctaw people raised $173 and sent it for the relief of Irish famine victims. And Ireland at the time was ruled by Britain, and by the Victorians, in fact, who were very careful bookkeepers. So we have a record of that money having been received and how it was paid out to help some of the starving Irish. And while I was serving as President of Ireland from 1998 to 1997, we marked the 3 years of the 150th anniversary of that great famine. And I went all over the world and unveiled statues and plaques and took part in many ceremonies to commemorate the great famine. But one that I remember particularly was going to Oklahoma and thanking the Choctaw people 150 years later for their generosity towards the Irish people when we badly needed friends. There was no prior connection, there was no advantage to the Choctaw people. It was a pure act of humanitarian concern. And it seemed to me to link very well with what we're going to talk about this evening. When I say we are going to talk about, I did say that I felt with such bright bright college students here who've taken part in the Model UN that I should talk for maybe half the time, under a half an hour, and then I hope that with the excellent acoustics in this room, that we can have at least some conversation. I'd love to hear your views, either on some of the things that I've been saying, or your own thoughts about the United Nations, or about some of the events that are happening, for example, in Tunisia and Egypt and Bahrain and Yemen. A lot of very volatile situations, and those young people who are coming out in the street, what do they want? They want jobs, yes, but they also want more freedom. They want human dignity. They want human rights. And that for me is very encouraging, because as I discovered when I was serving as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, there was a tendency to say that the human rights of freedoms that we talk about, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, are Western freedoms, Western rights, and not universal. But it's quite clear, in fact, that they are the rights that young Arabs in the street, including, I'm glad to say, many young women, also aspire to and want. But I think it's worth posing the question in this audience at the very start, since I know you've been focusing more on human rights this year and have had the Human Rights Council as one of the bodies that you've been engaging with. Let's pause for a minute and think about the words human rights, because we don't always have total agreement about what comes to mind when you say the words human rights. For many people, I would say probably for most of you in this audience, you think of what I would call the Amnesty International agenda, political prisoners, Guantanamo Bay issues, torture, countries that have bad human rights records, Cuba, China. These are the kind of issues that come to mind. But if I was talking to an audience in Africa, what would come to mind far more would be rights to food and safe water and health and education and shelter. And I spent my 5 years as High Commissioner trying to bring those two streams of rights. We call them civil and political rights on the one hand, and economic, social and cultural rights together as the joined up agenda of human rights, that you have to care about both. So it's not enough for a country to say, we'll build up our economic and social rights, and then maybe later we'll have political freedoms. That's more the China model and the former Soviet Union, etc. Or we will focus on civil and political rights, and we regard rights to food and health and education as only political aspirations, not really rights. But in fact, if you look at the international human rights system, all governments of the world have signed up to at least one of the international covenants and conventions, and many countries have signed up to more than one, and some to the full range of covenants and conventions. The two main covenants being the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Governments voluntarily sign up to these covenants, say that they will uphold them, that they will protect people from violations of them, that there will be no discrimination, and that in the case of economic and social rights, they will progressively realise these rights without discrimination. So it's not as if these rights are instant and can be delivered straight away. It's progressive use of budgetary and other policy measures to ensure that there is a protection and promotion of these rights. And of course, as we know, and as I certainly learned during my 5 years as High Commissioner, the problem is not the signing up and ratifying of these covenants and conventions by governments. It's the implementation. It's the carrying through in practice, as I'm sure you have discussed. Let me go back a little bit and tell you of my own influences, if you like, briefly, and how I became interested in human rights. It actually started very early. I grew up in the west of Ireland in a non-political family. Both my parents were physicians, doctors, but I was wedged between 4 brothers. 2 brothers older than me and 2 brothers younger than me. So I had to be interested in human rights and equality. All means at my disposal to assert those rights. And I was lucky enough to have a grandfather who had been a champion as a lawyer of the small guy, the poor guy, the peasant against the landlord, etc. And he'd had to retire early from ill health. And I would visit him at the age of 10 or 11 or 12, and being the only granddaughter around, I was a bit of a favourite of his. But he didn't know